you sing with me? What's gonna happen? We don't know. All of us composers, we are making it up as we go. So I'm a little nervous, but it's not about me, and it's not about Shaun. It's a little about Shaun. And it's not about you, my loves. It's about all of us and the holy future longing to come through. And what are we gonna do? 'Cause I don't know if you've heard, friend, but it's the end of the world, friends. We heard it on the news. It was like www.yahoo.com/ElonMusk.gov. Oh, and the end of theater too. So what are we here to do? Well, when I listen to you, my fellow composers, when I listen to you, I think we're here to imagine new worlds and to find a better way. I think the future sings to us. It calls to us with songs to sing and words to say. And we have to call it back. We have to call it in. Call the future in. Call a new way in. Call it in. Okay, will you do it with me? Call it in.
Call it in.
Call it in.
Call it in.
Let's call it in.
Call it in.
Yeah, okay, let's call it in.
Call it in.
Oh, okay. Where do we start? With the heart, and then what's beneath our feet? Subway and sewer and concrete and the detritus of all of our failures, the detritus of all of our sorrows, every old and broken and fucked up way that caused harm. Let's plant it 1,000 feet and let it cook in the belly of the earth until it becomes a compost heap. Let's call it in.
Let's call it in.
We'll call it in.
Call it in.
Okay, let's call it in.
Call it in.
Call it in.
Call it in.
What's above us? Satellite and star. Stars that shine their light this far. Even though many of them have already died. Which reminds me that all my beloveds who have died are also beside me, shining in their light. Let's call them in. You got it. Call them in.
Call it in.
Let's call them in.
Call it in.
Let's call them in. Okay, I'm having a good time now. What's behind us? Who knows? I think it's our grandmothers and our grandfathers and our great-great-great-grandparents all the way back to deep water fish whose only wish was for us to jump up and live. And I think they stood in a space or in the woods just like now, and they tried to imagine a better future somehow. And they thought they fucked it up, and they tried again, and they fucked it up, and they tried again. And that's why it's in our own blood to begin and to begin and begin. They planted a garden. They knew that they would never eat, and that's why we have something sweet. That's why we have something sweet, my loves. Let's call them in.
Call it in.
Let's call them in.
Call it in.
Oh, let's call them in.
Call it in.
Let's call them in.
Call
Okay,
it in.
here's the hard part. what's in front of us. That's the future part. That's the part we don't know. But yes, we can give it a shot, though, right? So I pray for reparations, for abolition, for education, for nutrition, for art that cracks the heart and feeds it. I pray for art for everyone who needs it. I pray for art that stands in the street and demands a revolution. I demand art that demands a revolution. My loves, can we call it in? Let's call it in.
Call it in.
Can we please call it in?
Call it in.
Oh, I want to call it in.
Call it in.
Oh, okay, let's call it in. Clap?
Call it in.
Let's add a clap.
Call it in.
Hey, let's call it in.
Call it in.
Keep singing that.
Call it in.
But now add a harmony.
Call it in.
I know you have an MFA in musical theater. Come
Call
on.
it in.
Oh, call it in.
Call it in.
Call it in.
Call it in.
Oh, I think Jonathan Larson.
Call it in.
I think he was trying to call it in.
Call it in.
And I think that's why we're here, to remember him and to love him and say thank you, thank you. We're here and we will call it in.
Call it in.
Yeah, yeah.
Call it in. Call it in.
One more. Let's call it in.
Call it in.
Let's call it in.
Call it in.
Let's call it in.
Call it in. Call it in.
We did it.